and welcome to Reede Scholars Live. I'm your host, Dr. Mary Fleming, and current president of Reede Scholars. I have with me back today Dr. Mallory Williams, who is our um, former Reede Scholar president, current trauma surgeon, and working for Howard University, and also serves in the U.S. Reserve Medical Corps in Honduras at the moment. And so we had a great conversation a few weeks ago that was so power pack that we knew we needed to come back and talk about it a little more. So I'll let you kind of jump right in because this is such a intense conversation and we have a lot to talk about. And not to keep people too long, but where we ended the conversation and talking about police brutality and policy, we were kind of just doing the backstory, trying to understand why we were here, what was the impetus to the conversation and the response by the people at the time. And while we continue the conversation, we still have a lot to unpack. So why don't you just kind of give people a little bit more background on why you think this is an important conversation, what we were able to talk about last time, but why it's important to keep the conversation going.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. I just want to thank you, Madam President, for the persistence and the detail to continue the conversation. Thank Reede Scholars as always. And let me just say, we had a great conversation last time. I really thought that we were able to get a lot of good things out there. So last time we talked about why people had the response that they had to Mr. Floyd's death because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We talked about what that response was, and we talked about some of the general feelings of African Americans within the democracy. Some of the things that came out from a policy standpoint was we talked about the third degree homicide and the fact that it was only available in 3 states. And we talked about the punitive damages, depending on whether you were in Florida 40 years or whether you were in Pennsylvania 25 years. And we talked about the importance of a district attorney and how we need to focus our attentions when electoral exercises are being held on that position because of prosecutorial discretion and the role that can particularly play in communities of color. And then we got down to the very end where we were wrapping up, and I made the statement to you. I said, we have to have patience in this discussion because it is a lot to take in, to understand, and then to effectively deal with. To respond excessively. So I think if we look at where we were when we had the first conversation, which was under the immediate moments of Mr. Floyd's death, and you look at where we are now, it's a perfect opportunity to talk about this, because what we have seen since those immediate moments is that we have seen kind of backlashes to the protests against what was seen on camera. We've seen, in some instances, in some jurisdictions, we've seen police en masse resign and walk off duty, reminiscent of 1919 when the Boston police did that. But they did it for a much different reason. They did it because of working circumstances and low pay. We've also seen conversations about defunding of police, and we really haven't unpacked that fully to understand what that means, but we've seen people already take positions on whether or not that's something that's electorally possible if you're trying to win an election, or something that should really be done. What I want to say and begin this conversation with is the issue of police collective bargaining, and how collective bargaining under state laws allow for protections that are very unique in this democracy conferred upon our police, which I don't believe, and many other people don't believe in the peer review literature, engenders an environment for the type of reform that every American would want in their community. Because really, as we focus on communities of color, Mary, we're really talking about conferring on all communities in America a just law enforcement policy.
Right.
So let's deal with the overarching themes that we're working under before we get to the specific discussion. Blacks are 3 times more likely to be killed by police. Okay. And it's an emotional statistic that you can't immediately respond to just based on the magnitude, because Blacks could also be 3 times more likely to be in positions where they appear to be assaulting or appear to be causing harm to police, in which case the statistic would make sense. And I'm not saying that that is the case. I'm just saying that we have to be careful how we unpack the data.
Yeah.
The statistic that we have to focus on and need to be more invigorated about from a policy standpoint is that Black people are 1.3 times more likely to be unarmed than white people when they are killed. And so this whole idea that they are posing a threat to a law enforcement's person's life becomes in question because they are unarmed. Right. And I'm not saying that you can't pose a threat to someone's life and be unarmed. I'm just simply saying that we know police are armed at all times by constitutional law. Right. If we look at the 8 biggest police departments in this country, they are responsible for killing Black and brown people at rates that are higher than the homicide rate of the nation. These are statistics that we just have to begin to try to understand as a responsible democracy, and certainly as responsible policy people. And so why do I start there, and how do I get from there to this issue of collective bargaining? Well, police are allowed to collective bargain through state labor laws. And they're allowed to collective bargain based upon 3 issues. One is wages, and that's fair. No one would take that away from them. The other is hours, and that's fair. No one would take that away from them. That's like air pilots and waitresses and any other unionized workforce. But then there is this thing called terms and conditions of employment, which have been broadly interpreted by courts to allow them to begin to negotiate their discipline within their union contracts. That's the thing that America and policy people need to understand. As a physician, you and I cannot negotiate the terms of what happens to us if we're found to be in malpractice or beneath the standard of care in the hospital. We don't even have the right to collective bargaining as a professional class. Okay, let's just start there, right? All right. We certainly cannot walk out en masse on the American people in protest to anything. We do not have those rights. Police do. But this idea that using the clause of terms and conditions of employment, we can then extrapolate that to now set the context for how we will be punished is the jump that sets the protections, the hedges around law enforcement when there is violations of people's constitutional rights. That's something that's very important. So let's talk about what that clause has been allowed to do inside of real police contracts. Let's start with some of the most egregious things. A police officer's file can be expunged of all citizen complaints and all disciplinary action after 3 years in jurisdiction. So that means it doesn't matter what I did in those 3 years. Doesn't matter how I have acted in my legislative responsibilities to the society. My contract, my collective bargaining allows that to be all wiped away and never seen or used in any other incident that I may have. Wow. Wouldn't you like it that if we got rid of the National Data Bank, And you just get all of your malpractice, all your incidents, all your suits just get wiped away. Not saying you have any, not saying I have any, but wow, what a unique professional halo of security to operate in, right? It allows for, even when police are disciplined and put on probation, right? And away from administrative leave, away from their job, for them to take vacation time and pay themselves, use it as vacation time and administrative leave, so they don't even suffer the consequences of losing pay when there is a legitimate complaint against them before a grand jury. It allows them to use the arbitrary process. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't have a right to use the arbitrary process.
Right.
What I'm saying is, it should not be that when they are found guilty of something, that they can then use their collective bargaining contracts to bring in an arbitrator to have that guilt removed, which they have the right to do, which nobody else in society can have done. They have what's called a law enforcement bill of rights, which guarantees them certain assurances. Maryland is one state that has it out of 16, that civilians or the society cannot hold them accountable, right? So this whole citizen review board thing that we have for some police jurisdictions, it limits their scope and what they can actually do to police. It guarantees them certain assurances of when they can be interrogated. It neutralizes them from having any being compelled to do a lie detector test. Okay, it neutralizes them from ever having Freedom of Information Acts to discover what has taken place within their investigations of them. All right, this is powerful stuff that is emanating from labor law and a clause that says terms and conditions of employment that has expanded now to give them immense protections from the accountability that we as citizens have a right to expect because of their unique powers, and any civilized society would expect. And so I've talked to you about their powers based upon their collective bargaining agreements. I haven't mentioned to you their powers that are already baked into the society anyway. Right? Which is the benefit of the doubt that the prosecutor automatically bestows upon them as opposed to anyone else. I haven't talked to you about the civil law, because they are public servants, the civil laws that enable them to be empowered to some respect as well in terms of how they are punished in the civil society. So that's already baked in before we get to their collective bargaining. Now, what do we have as a society to hold police accountable? It's important to understand that.
Yes.
We have three basic tools. And I would say there's a fourth one, which is hiring, who we hire. But let's take that one off the table. There are three basic tools. One is called the exclusionary rule. And that's grounded in the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. And the exclusionary rule simply says this: if you do something criminal to violate someone's constitutional rights, that the evidence that you gain to convict them cannot be used. So if there's any violation of constitutional rights, illegality in how you procure the evidence, we throw that out. Okay, we don't use that. So that's an incentive to maintain your constitutional rights, and it is positioned exactly the way the society is structured, right? You are innocent until proven guilty, and even if you're guilty, if the state does something illegal to prove it, you still gonna be innocent, right? That's the way our founders envisioned the society working.
Yes.
Right. Then you have civil litigation, which, by the way, I must say, is really the remedy that most people of color have had to use when they've lost loved ones. So when we talk about Laquan McDonald, when we talk about all of the other Black men and women who have been shot, they really have gone down through Benjamin Crump. They've gone down a civil road for remedies, because when we talk about police accountability, let's be clear, 99% of incidences where charges are brought against police in wrongly committed homicide, whether it be first degree, second degree, third degree, or any degree, okay, end up in no one being charged. They don't even get past the grand jury, okay? So 99% of the time when charges are brought legitimately against police, nothing happens, all right? That tells you how effective our remedies are as opposed to how effective their protections are in the society. The third remedy, we talked about exclusionary rule, throwing out evidence when it's collected illegally. We talked about civil litigation, which is the one we most often have to use in communities of color. The third one is criminal prosecution. And I just told you what the result of criminal prosecution is. If you are missing the mark 99% of the time, many people would argue, Mary, that ain't a tool at all. Who uses a car that don't start 99% of the time? Who writes with a pen that don't write 99% of the time? I mean, so we call that a tool, but in essence, we understand that right now as it exists in our society, that really has been an ineffective tool, very hard, very difficult to penetrate. And so that's where we are. And now if you're ensconced as a police officer with that type of power, collective bargaining, okay, civil rules and regulations that protect you as well, and plus your benefit of doubt that you wear as soon as you put on the uniform, then you can act and move in ways in the society that are peculiar with almost impunity, right? So when the police officers in New York turn their backs with the cameras on a democratically elected mayor Bill de Blasio, because they disagree with something he said, and they're in uniform and they protest in uniform in a public space, which, by the way, as a person who wears a uniform, is something you should never do, okay? We submit ourselves to civilian leadership. That is part of, that's what makes the democracy work. I can't throw a fit and decide I'm gonna have a protest on the Army base because I don't like something that's going on in America. Okay, that's not how we conduct ourselves when we're in uniform, whether we're on the domestic side or whether we're on the international side serving in the broader military forces. But they felt comfortable doing that. And they were protected and unquestioned by many people when they did it. When you have mass number of officers deciding that they're going to resign at the same time down in Atlanta because they don't like what Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms has said or alluded to. This is what I would call simply a protected class of professionals moving and acting within their privilege in very peculiar ways, because they have the right to do that through their collective bargaining, okay? And they make good money. So one of the things that I have said as a citizen who pays taxes is that if you want to, in a COVID environment where a pandemic where 40 million people in America have lost their jobs, if you want to resign over this and you're making somewhere between $55,000 and $80,000 a year, bye. There's somebody else who can be trained and who will be responsible and who will be accountable. Or there's somebody who will be trained and sit in the same privilege that you sit in and act more responsibly. Right. So we have to begin, as we look at policies moving forward, we have to do all the things we talked about in the last discussion in terms of focusing on the DA, think about expanding third degree murder charges in different states. But we also have to begin to deconstruct and understand the labor agreements that we as a society are entering into with the people that protect us, And the fact that those labor agreements do not occur under the light of the public scrutiny.
Right.
They are shielded, okay? Yet they impact the broader society in major ways. We have to understand those things. And I'll be happy to take any questions you may have to just go further in some respects with some of the observations that I make.
And so, I always, want to be clear when we have these very in-depth conversations that, the fundamental part of this is protecting the humanity of people broadly, right?
Yes.
Like this
Yes.
conversation is about making sure that we all are protected and all given the benefit of the doubt in the situations that warrant it. And I think
Yes.
the second thing is really understanding the power dynamics is what you're speaking to, and
Yes.
and how those power dynamics allow people to not protect us fully. So we talk about this is not a conversation. It's not an anti-police conversation.
No.
I want police to protect and serve. I want to make sure that I feel safe walking to my car and out of my house, going to the hospital in the middle of the night, right? Like police
Absolutely.
are vital, but they also we also have to think about, like you said, the policies that allow these power dynamics that lead to them not protecting us in the full way, and allow for accountability and discipline when necessary. And
Yes.
we've talked about a lot of people, and we talked about how George Floyd's life and death was kind of sparked this conversation in contemporary times in the COVID-19 pandemic. But I also always have to bring up Breonna Taylor from my hometown,
Absolutely.
and thinking really about how that truly speaks to what you're saying about accountability within the system, right? So we have somebody who we know constitutional rights were violated, civil rights were
Yes.
violated, and yet months and months and months later, we're still trying to figure out what's happening, why isn't there anything done, and it speaks to these protections that are built into the system. And so,
Yes.
as you mentioned, you touched on earlier, one of the responses from a lot of people is to defund the police. And so I think when people hear that, they hear abolish the police, right? Or we don't
Yes.
need police. And that's not
Right. Get rid of them. Right.
no police. No. And so nobody's
Right.
saying that. We need
Right.
we need that body of people that we understand to be the police. But
Yes.
we need to restructure um, their training. We need to restructure their accountability. We need to restructure the policies around their protection at the sacrifice of the individuals that they are
Yes.
trying to protect. So, talk to us a little bit about the defund the police conversation and movement, and what that really means.
Great question. Happy to do so. So, 2/3 of America's police are unionized, which means 2/3 of the police operate under collective bargaining and the powers that we just talked about. We don't, as a nation, need to be scared of restructuring a professional class.
Mm,
We've done it before. Physicians have gone through it in terms of payment. We have restructured the finance industry after a major collapse economically in this country. We have had to restructure the power of corporations in this country, from a laissez-faire type of approach from government to a more regulated approach as it comes to both workers and how they move in their power in the broader political spectrum. We have to, as a nation, from time to time, restructure major components of our democracy. And so this is what Thomas Jefferson meant when he was talking about refreshing the democracy, right? Being engaged civically enough to see when, well, we need to do a little bit more here, or we need to do a little bit more there to make the union perfect, the constant process of perfecting our union. When we talk about defunding the police, we're not talking about the lack of a need for law enforcement in the nation. We're not questioning whether or not they are an important element of the democracy. What we are saying is that as a democracy, we have to reallocate how we use a limited amount of resources. The same thing we said when we restructured healthcare. The same question. It was not whether or not doctors were necessary or needed. It was that healthcare costs were beginning to crowd out our ability to do other valuable things like Head Start, other things that are necessary like elder care. So it's the same conversation. How do we spend an American tax dollar? If we can spend an American tax dollar in a way that requires less policing from a human resource standpoint, then that's a good thing. Okay, so if, for instance, we know that for every 1% increase in food insecurity, there's a 12% increase in violent crime, well, it makes a lot of sense to go ahead on and put a Kroger
Right.
or a A&P, on the corner, make sure that it's open 24 hours so that we don't have the 12% increase in violent crime and then put officers and their families in harm's way because of violent crime, right? If we know that a lighted, well cared for, well maintained street reduces violent crime, well, it makes a lot of more sense to put resources into those environmental elements that reduce violent crime. If employment, okay, as we saw during the end of the 90s, is correlated with a decrease in violent crime, then it makes more sense to have pro-job growth programs from a policy level than it does to quote unquote get tough on crime and hire a bunch of more police, okay, which again are in harm's way at a higher expense. So we're talking about how to rationally spend an American tax dollar. Defunding of police is simply reprioritization of budgetary tax dollars in ways that are strategically aligned with law enforcement's goals. Okay, so it's saying that yes, we can buy another gun. Yes, we can buy another camera or drone. Yes, we can have another police officer on the beat, which may be necessary in alignment with these other things. But there are other things that in society also dictate crime levels that we have studied from a sociological standpoint. And if we can do those things, then it makes sense to do those things. Let me juxtapose defunding the police, which is bad language around sensible policy, with broken windows policy, right? So broken windows policy led to 80% of people of color being searched or harassed or stopped en route to their freedom, jobs, social engagements, or whatever, and being unguilty. Being found not to be guilty of any offense. So in order to institute broken windows policies in New York, we had to make uncomfortable 80% of brown and black people who we searched. And yet it's amazing to me how acceptable people would get on news programs and in public environments and talk about how great it was. They liked the reward of reduced crime so much that they were willing to inconvenience the hell out of brown and black people. And so when we talk about reprioritization of funding in the public sphere to get that same reward, why is it so objectionable, okay, if we like it so much in broken windows policy that we don't even care that our fellow brothers and sisters who may be brown and black are inconvenienced? So I think it's bad language around good policy, and I think we haven't had enough conversation about it. And I think if we have that intellectual conversation and engagement around it, the same people who are excited about the rewards in broken windows policy will be excited about the rewards in this as well, but we do need to reconfigure the language because it sounds as if it is hostile toward a particular professional class in the society when in reality it's just rational economics.
Right. And you know, and I think we have to just jump right now just because of what's going on in current events when we talk about those policies and what's happening now with policing the urban populations, right? And so we talk about the situation, if you will, where there's this perceived criminality in certain populations, and we're not talking about what's actually happening in those neighborhoods that's causing crime rates to go up, or if they're actually going up, or why the what the specifics are. We can go into that too, but now, do we send in national troops to these areas to then police them, and what does that mean? Is that right? Is it wrong? That type of the part of the conversation. What I know you have, I'm sure you have strong feelings about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a perfect segue to contemporary times. And we have to be able to discern politics from rational policy, right? And so we're nearing a national election, and it is convenient if you're trying to protect a congressional delegation in terms of getting them reelected, to bring up issues that spur voters to the polls, particularly your base, right? But I don't want to throw that out there to negate legitimate issues. When a funeral is shot up and 17 people die in a civil society, that someone needs to take note of that. No matter what the colors and party and all that's a problem, right? That should not occur. When the 4th of July is a peak time for shootings inside of urban environments, that's a problem, right? So we have to address those problems with real solutions and with real answers, right? So on one hand, the assertion has been, we're going to install federal law enforcement agents to reduce the level of crime. There's resistance to that in some quarters who say, well, we don't need federal agents to do that. Okay, we don't want that to happen. Interesting observation, because it hasn't really gotten better, right? So to understand, to say that you don't need something when the situation is not getting better is a provocative standpoint that may be defendable, but is shaky ground at best. The same vulnerable populations who are at risk when a few police begin to act countercultural, or the populations who are at risk when crime elements begin to expand and act more in a public and incendiary way. And so my position is, if injecting federal agents in any environment, during any time, next to election, not next to election, is responsible for one less innocent kid catching a stray bullet, then we ought to do it. Because I can't defend a political position that allows children who are innocent and uninvolved in the transaction or uninvolved in the events of the day to be injured and to be killed simply because we didn't have the resources from a law enforcement standpoint there to avoid that issue or to prevent that issue or deter that issue. Okay, that's a non-defendable position from my standpoint. But I think you bring up the greater issue, actually. And that is, what are the situations and circumstances that allow for the proliferation of violence and any crime in a particular community. And are those not societal constructs that we can see and alter? Which really gets to Johann Gottling's concept of structural violence. And what Johann says is that when you prevent people from meeting their basic needs, or there are significant barriers in environments that prevent or deter people from meeting basic needs, then what you have is societal structure creating a condition of violence against that population because they don't eat at the same rate as other people. They don't sleep well at the same rate. Great data on PTSD in urban environments. They don't have access to their basic needs. And if we go back one segment to the previous discussion and reprioritization of how we spend tax dollars and understanding that when we spend tax dollars on education, job training, social issues, that is a form of fighting crime. If we connect those things, right, logically, then we can see that you can send federal troops in. But if you don't send money in, the federal troops are going to stay at a rate about 10 times the cost as what it would cost you to fix the societal structure issues. And so the federal troops then don't become a logical solution because they are not a efficient expenditure of the tax dollar. Now, I'm not saying that they may not be needed initially or for some interval period. What I am saying that over the long term, if you don't deal with the root causes of the issue, then they have to stay, and then you begin to spin your way irrationally into a hole. And so we have to always refocus the conversation on the societal structure and the marked differences between what we spend for a child's education inside of in the city of Chicago versus what we spend for that same child's education in Highland Park and in Lake Forest. Because there's an exponential difference in how we're educating America's children. And as long as we permit those gradients to exist, almost consensually, right, we're going to get some other gradients that exist between those communities, right? And so I think it really is an interesting conversation we're having. I don't know necessarily the right answer for every locale. What I do know is that I'm happy that we're forcing the conversation and we're having the conversation, because the reality is that while there is this comment that all of these cities have been ran by Democratic mayors, that's always thrown out there kind of as a back comment to the conditions in urban environments. We know that every urban environment in this country, okay, is heavily contingent and dependent upon both the state and federal government for multiple funding streams, whether it's roads, whether it's federal buildings, we can go down the line. And so federal policy and state policy has huge overhangs on urban environments and how they operate. There's no doubt about that. So it doesn't matter whether the mayor is Democrat or Republican. The realities of the finances in that environment in terms of changing societal structures are heavily contingent upon state and federal resources.
So, I mean, one of the things that we know, and most people know, but I was going to say that we know from our public health training is that, um, and you basically touched on this, that we have an issue right now that needs to be treated, right? And so we need the Band-Aid fix at the moment, right? We need to make sure people are safe in real time, but while we're doing that, we need to examine upstream issues so that we don't keep repeating ourselves to a point where we just keep putting a Band-Aid on it, right? And so that's kind of what we're getting at. And so, I know you need to get your workday started, but I hope that you can leave a couple of go-to or next step items for people. So, in the different arenas that we've talked about, what do you think? And keeping that frame of mind, like we know we've got to do something right now, but we also need to do something that is going to work for us in the future. What are our next step high impact policy items that you think will get us to the next point of the conversation, if you will?
Yeah, you're spot on with the question, as usual. Listen, so first thing, DC's council, where I work at, District of Columbia City Council, passed an amendment to their Police Reform Act. And in that amendment, it basically says that the idea that any language, and I want to emphasize any language that speaks of police discipline within the collective bargaining contract will not be allowed.
Mm.
So the District of Columbia has taken an approach, and an appropriate one, that terms and conditions of employment will no longer preclude full accountability from a disciplinary language standpoint inside of union contracts. Okay, I could take the union conversation one step further and talk to you about the overall diversity of police union administrators and arbitrators. Okay, and how that lack of diversity can once again be reflective of a deeper problem in terms of the communities that are being policed and the contracts that are being negotiated. Because the question really fundamentally boils down to, do I negotiate a contract in that community than I would in my community, right? And so it's a deep situation. I think local jurisdictions who have the influence and the insight to begin to make those small changes in how the collective bargaining is going to be done for their jurisdiction, since they're the one paying for the contract, I think that's a huge beginning. Because first of all, I simply don't believe that most police have a problem with being held accountable for their actions. I believe most police rightfully fear that through the retrospectoscope, their actions may not be fully understood, because that's logical. Because we go through the same thing in medicine. It's different when you're making the decision at 2 a.m. in the morning and the resources that you may have available to you may not be those that you have at 9 a.m. in the morning, and you do the things that you do. We get that. And no one wants to see people who are acting in good faith suffer bad consequences that forever affect them, right? So we got to acknowledge rational fears in the society and say, yeah, I get that, right? And then create remedies for those rational fears, okay? Arbitration is a great remedy, all right? But what we can't do is acquiesce the whole issue, because I also believe that many police understand that they got some people in their society, in their profession, that don't need to be there, right? And I don't think, just like we as doctors got some people in our profession that don't need to be here, right? And teachers got some people that don't need to be in classrooms, right? So we get that as well. So I believe that taking that policy step of accountability is not hard, save for the union who wants to maintain the broad privileges that exist there. But I think that can be dealt with. I also think, and this gets to what we're going to talk about at the National Medical Association panel session, we've got to begin having some rational discussions with one another. That means the community and the police, and talking about how we build sustainable relationships, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to have that discussion in part on August the 1st at the National Medical Association. But we can't continue to refuse to sit down with one another and really begin to engage one another about community policing, about how community policing and cooperation lowers crime rates. Because where we're stuck right now, Mary, and you and I were talking about this, is we're either stuck with aggressive over-policing or passive under-policing that leaves the same vulnerable population at risk for horrific consequences. Neither one of those options is acceptable. And I think many problems are handled best at the local level. And I think having a vehicle, right, to sit down and have good conversations about the hurt, the concerns, because that's on both sides. There have been innocent police officers that have been shot, off duty, on duty,
Yeah.
who then have to be buried. Let's just acknowledge that. But I think the conversation, the centrality of that conversation has to be built around how do we function together as an organized unit, right? And part of that really gets to where do police live? In DC, you got to live in DC, right? Do you live in the communities that you police? Because when you don't, that's when a lot of other things can begin to creep into the equations. And we got right now police that don't even live near the communities that they're police. When I say community, I mean broadly, right? So we got police that don't live anywhere near the communities that they police and speak about the communities that they police in almost cinematic ways. Dare I say, the way Denzel portrayed Alonzo in Training Day, which was really a great work that foretold all of what we're seeing now from an artistry standpoint. And so we got to have a conversation, and then we have to have legislative accountability rebuilt into this process so that labor law does not negate accountability.
Yes, and that last point, making this a conversation about us collectively and not a us and them situation, because I think that's when it becomes dangerous.
Absolutely.
Broadly, we're all part of one, community, and we know that this doesn't have to be like this, right? I mean, there are plenty of other examples in other countries across the world who have a better relationship with their law enforcement and have much better outcomes as far as, death by the police and, just underlying, criminality in the society. So we can do better. It doesn't
Right.
have to be this way. So as we close, leave us with a word of optimism. What are you looking forward to? What do you think? What do you think the good that's gonna come out of this conversation moving forward?
Well, I think the moment brings great optimism because you got unification of communities that have never really been unified around the need to do anything about this issue. And I think Mr. Floyd's death demonstrated a recognition and understanding in the broader society that had just simply never been there. And that was really a unification of both the videotape and then the context in which the videotape was released, which was a pandemic in which people had time to pay attention to what was going on. I think that unification immediately reverberated through the political spectrum, and people saw that the classic way of dividing up the electorate was just simply not going to work again for this particular issue. And so now you have a national conversation. You have a former police chief being considered for a role as high as the vice president of the United States. And that's not an endorsement, that's just a statement of fact. And so I think the issue is going to carry the day in this next election. I don't think it's any doubt that whatever people were thinking about was going to be the major issue. This is going to be a major issue as we go into November in terms of determining who our next president and who my next commander in chief is. And I think the structural organization is aligned around holding individuals accountable. I don't think we've had that accountability before, particularly at the Attorney General level of really begin to substantively do something. Listen, a consent decree is important. I don't want to minimize that. Examining and understanding what police officers and police departments have done to communities is very, very important. But you also got to understand, based on the bargaining agreements, even the people who were executing those consent decrees upon the with the jurisdiction of the DOJ, the Department of Justice, even they said we can't even fully begin to understand the magnitude of the transgressions against people's constitutional rights because they've been expunged from the record based upon the bargaining agreements that occurred. They write that. And so even when you have a consent decree in place, right, that gives people broad powers to come in and scrutinize activity, if the data has been erased from the database, they're left with minimal facts to begin to put together a story. So we have to acknowledge that, how do we want to be able to tackle these problems as a rational society? It's not just about punishment. How do you train police appropriately if you look in a database and nothing is there about what went wrong? I mean, how do you know where to put the dollars? I mean, do I put it into unconscious bias? Do I put it in wielding of weapons and how to wield weapons in terms of in a public environment? Do I put it into de-escalation techniques? Where am I directing my dollars for the biggest bang if I don't have a database that shows me the incidents and allows me to say this is where the most resources are needed. So I think that this time, as I said in the last conversation, I think this time is terribly different because it is going to mean an involved and engaged segment of the electorate, which will have consequences, or the abdication of a certain part of the electorate, which will have consequences as well. That's how I see it. But I think the idea that we're unified around a perspective that we need to look at it, we need to examine it, and that needs to be a action item that is relevant to changing the scope and magnitude of the problem is a great thing. And we haven't had that before.
Well, thank you, Dr. Williams, as always, for such a thought-provoking conversation. And I think kind of wrapping that up with the medical analogy, we need to understand the symptoms so we can diagnose and treat the disease, right? And so I think this is a great conversation. I am optimistic that the country is having the conversation and that hopefully we can work together to make this a better place for us all to live. I look forward to your panel at the National Medical Association. It is always a great avenue, even though we'll be meeting virtually this year, but it's always a great platform for robust conversations and having those hard, important but meaningful conversations. So I look forward to that. So be safe and be well where you are. And I know we will talk again. So I look forward to our next conversation and seeing where we are at that point.
As always, Madam President, thank you for your leadership and thank you for the time for this conversation.
Thank you for listening to Reede Scholars Live. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, or subscribe to our YouTube